Thanks everybody for coming. I don't need to introduce Dan, but thank you, Dan, for agreeing to speak today for this seminar. Dan's going to talk about some of the work that he's been doing with ICER, which I think everybody knows about. They just came out with their first report, draft report, or final report?
Draft report.
Okay. That'll be cited in the newsletter tomorrow, but so if you want a copy of that, I'm sure Dan and Suri can help provide that, but it's all yours.
All right, thanks, Glenn. Yeah, so when Glenn asked me to present and talk a little bit about ICER and what we're doing, what the work we're doing is, I thought it would be kind of interesting to look at sort of the broader picture and not just focus solely on ICER and talk about some of the other value frameworks that have come out, because there's a lot of interesting stuff that's going on right now and a lot of discussion about what should be included in these value frameworks. So I'm going to talk first of all about the need for providing value in healthcare. Just a really quick overview for those of you who are less familiar with pharmacoeconomics and setting up the discussion a little bit. Then we're going to talk about how to estimate the costs and benefits of pharmaceuticals and where some of the controversies lie. And then talking about the frameworks themselves and how these frameworks are trying to assess the value of pharmaceuticals. So you've probably seen this slide over and over and over again. Prescription drug spending as percent of gross domestic product. Sometimes people put up the proportion of healthcare costs as a percent of gross domestic product. The thing that blew me away is, I've always known that drug spending has been around the 5 to 8% level over the last several years, but from 2010 to 2015, it's amazing how this slide now is showing it's up around 11% of overall GDP, which is where healthcare spending used to be. Now it's pharmaceuticals are approximately the same as what healthcare spending used to be 15, 20 years ago. When we look at it in some different ways, the rising costs of pharmaceuticals are a burden to consumers. This graph shows prescription drug costs in billions over the last 10 years and the percent of all personal health care. And while as a percent of personal health care, drug costs really aren't changing a whole lot over time, it just shows that overall healthcare expenditures are clearly increasing because prescription drug costs are increasing and now make up 21%. $550 billion. When we look at this in another way, what we're seeing is the rising cost of pharmaceuticals is also a burden to payers. From 1960 through to 2015, we see the government and private health insurance continue to pick up a larger and larger proportion of these healthcare costs. So why are these costs increasing so quickly? And one of the explanations is that the U.S. pays a disproportionate burden of drug development costs and overall pharmaceutical costs. So here I have some of the blockbusters that we've seen in the last few years: Humira, Advair, Lantus, Crestor, Januvia, Sovaldi, and Herceptin. And the costs in the U.S., which is blue, Canada is orange, France is gray, and Germany is yellow. And for the U.S., these are the discounted prices. And what we see in all of these is that these drug costs are much higher in the U.S. than in these other countries, or the drug prices are more in the U.S. than other countries, and that some of these didn't fit on the graph with the with what I had here. Sovaldi and Herceptin in particular are incredibly expensive. The monthly price is incredibly high for these, and so in order to give an accurate depiction for the ones that are much less costly, like Advair and Lantus, we needed to adjust the graphs that we could see. So I thought, well, maybe these were selected and wanted to look at other drug prices. So this looked at some other sources, and what I found, this was from Bloomberg. Here's 8 other, well, not, some of them are the same, but many are different. And what we see is that the U.S. drug price is usually double to 10 times the price in other countries, looking at these 14 countries rather. And when we look at, compared with the UK, when we look at the top, what is this, 8 or 10 drugs, the US on average is paying 3 times more for the top 10 drugs than in the UK. And it seems to be pretty common across the board that the US is paying more. The only one that I found where another country is paying more for one drug is Sovaldi, and Saudi Arabia has a higher price than the US. That's the only example I've found so far where another country is paying a higher price for a particular medication. So what is the reason for these higher drug costs? And there's a lot of reasons that are presented in the literature. One of the main reasons is the creation of monopolies. Pharmaceutical companies have market exclusivity for branded products for a number of years. And while branded drugs comprise only 10% of dispensed prescriptions, they account for 72% of overall drug spending. So that's probably one of the main drivers. Another area where there's some monopolies, particularly in the US, is where there's single generic manufacturers. We've had a few examples of these in recent years, but it makes up about 2% of all the generics evaluated in one evaluation of this. But these 2% of generics increased in cost by over 1,000% once someone cornered the market on these drugs. So they were able to buy out all the manufacturers or somehow eliminate the other manufacturers from competition, became a monopoly, and then raised the price by over 1,000% for these old generic products. The other thing is the manufacturers get to set the price here in the US, and this is different from other countries. So this market exclusivity has an impact here as well, because the manufacturer can set the price and there's competition on the buyer side of the market. What we see is the manufacturer can set different prices, as monopolies tend to do, for different, say, insurers. Often what they'll do is set a price really high and then negotiate the price down with different insurers. And that's typically how monopolists operate. And the prices that each insurer pays are not available to the public, so it makes it easy for this type of negotiation to occur.
Why would they negotiate that if they have a monopoly?
So the question is, why would they negotiate if they have a monopoly? Because insurers may not be willing to pay the price that's initially set by the manufacturer. And
why
so,
agree to pay at all?
Sorry, I missed your question.
Why agree to pay at all? Like, it seems like either you want something or you don't. Were you talking about price elasticity to some extent?
No, I'm just talking about negotiation of prices to different insurers. So on the demand side of this equation, what we have is competition. So insurers can decide to cover something or not cover something. If they decide to not cover it, then the manufacturer has some incentive to lower the price until they meet the point where an insurer is willing to pay that amount for the product. So there's competition on the buyer side. The seller, there's no competition. They're the only one with that particular product in a market where there may be no competitors. Does that make sense?
So there is some price elasticity in terms of what you can negotiate with the manufacturer.
Yes, there is some price elasticity, but once your competitors are willing to pay for something, it makes the pressure much greater for you to cover it as well as an insurer.
Okay, yeah.
So And so if the pharmaceutical company prices something higher than anyone's willing to pay, but then negotiates discounts, once some insurers start agreeing to pay some other amount, it puts pressure on other insurers to also cover that product and pay some amount, which is also negotiated separately. But the thing is, the buyer may end up paying a different price because those prices are hidden. They don't know what other buyers have paid for those products.
That's the key, right? It's a black box. No one knows.
It's a black box, and that's how monopolies often work. Yeah. All right. So why does prescription drug costs matter? Well, there's a lot of different reasons. One's higher insurance premiums, increased taxpayer burden. As you saw, government is covering more and more of the medications over time, more and more of the cost of medications over time, which then comes out of taxes. Stagnant wages, because in a lot of cases, health insurance is provided through employers here in the U.S. And so, if the employer has to pay more for health care, they may not be as willing to increase the wages for workers. And then more extensive cost sharing with patients. When the burden becomes too much for insurers, government, and employers to pay, then the cost just gets passed on to the employees or to the patients. However, we do also have to realize that medications provide benefit. And in a lot of this discussion, I haven't talked at all about the benefit piece that these medications are providing. You know, it might be that they're replacing other healthcare costs. So surgeries might be lower because of some medications, or the need for other healthcare is lower because they provide benefit through better health and quality of life. So that needs to be considered. And so that's kind of the main focus of what I'm going to talk about here. From what perspective should value be estimated? There are a lot of different perspectives we could be looking at this from. And as you'll see, the frameworks that I'm going to describe later go after different perspectives. So a lot has changed since the first panel on cost effectiveness in medicine was held. I think it was about 1996 when that publication came out. And just recently, the second panel has come out, and they made a few different recommendations. They have reference cases, so they have 2 reference cases that they recommend. The first reference case is something done from the health system perspective or the healthcare perspective. They don't necessarily specify what that healthcare perspective should be. Should it be the insurers? Should it be the hospital or health systems perspective? They just kind of leave it a little bit open there. And then they recommend a societal perspective as well. They also acknowledge that there are different preferences, types of interventions, needs, and authorities of decision makers. It's important to preserve flexibility in how the analysts are going to put all these costs together. And as you'll see, there's reasons why there's that flexibility. But it's important to preserve that flexibility. And that value stems from illustrating the consequences of decisions from different viewpoints. So what may be a cost-effective intervention from a societal perspective may not always be cost-effective from a health systems perspective. Because of where the costs occur and where the benefits accrue. Here are some of their recommendations, and I hope you can see it with our screens here. But all studies should report, like I said, a reference case analysis based on the healthcare sector perspective, and then a second from the societal perspective. They have an inventory template that describes these different costs that may be considered or should be considered depending on the perspective. So for a formal healthcare sector, it's health outcomes and medical costs that should be considered. From the informal healthcare sector, patient time costs, unpaid caregiver time, transportation costs. And then interestingly, they have this other group from the non-healthcare sector, which is productivity, consumption, social services, legal and criminal justice, education, housing and environment, and other costs as well. One of the interesting things that they do in this recommendation is trying to make this whole process more transparent. And in doing so, they recommend that anyone who's doing one of these analyses fill out their impact inventory templates, that you can see what costs are included, and from the two different perspectives, the healthcare perspective and the societal perspective. And here you can see on this one, from the healthcare perspective, a lot of these costs are not applicable because they're not things the healthcare sector covers, but things like productivity, they recommend that they are included in societal perspective analyses, and if they're not included, you should be disclosing that you did not include those. Other recommendations are that health effects should be measured in terms of QALYs, which is not a big change from their recommendations in the first panel. It's no change, really. Results should be summarized as an incremental cost effectiveness ratio. And for societal reference cases, analysts should attempt to quantify and value non-health consequences unless they're likely to have negligible effects. So everything that is likely to have an effect should be captured and quantified as their recommendation for the societal perspective. And this kind of brings us to, what do patients value in healthcare? Well, I looked at a number of sources to try and find what patients state that they value. I mean, clearly pain and suffering, but different patients may have maybe wanting to avoid different side effects or different symptoms from drugs. Clearly, patients want to avoid death. From a humanistic perspective, physical function, inconvenience is actually a big one. Timeliness, provider kindness, access to care. And in terms of cost, lower premiums and point of care costs or out-of-pocket costs. Now, when you think about how patients shop for their health insurance, they often have little or no information on any of the clinical outcomes. And the humanistic outcomes probably reside more with the health system than they do with the insurance. So a lot of times patients base their choices on healthcare insurance on the costs, lower premiums and point of care costs, without always fully realizing what impact that might have on any of these other domains.
Dan, isn't pain and suffering humanistic rather than clinical?
It's both. Depends what aspect you're talking about of pain and suffering, but symptoms, there's costs to pain and suffering too. You're absolutely right though. There's a cost to it, and there's a clinical impact of it, and it's humanistic as well.
Okay, I know I teach it slightly differently in my classes, so there might be some mixed
Sure.
signals to the students, but so the framework that you use here.
Yeah, I probably shouldn't use the term pain and suffering, but I'm thinking of clinical outcomes and consequences, but not the humanistic component of that for the clinical outcomes. Yeah, good point. Thank you for clarifying.
But yeah, under humanistic, it's both. You include patient satisfaction points, which are totally consistent with how humanistic is, like quality of life and functioning, and then satisfaction. And those last four are all important to that patient satisfaction sphere.
Okay, so now I want to go over, just again, setting another piece of the groundwork for what these frameworks are considering as we're trying to work through what should be covered. And so limitations and issues with determining the benefits of therapies. First of all, there's heterogeneity in response to drugs. A good example of this is antipsychotic medications, where some patients respond to some of the medications, but not other of the medications. And sometimes there's some information that the patient has in advance that may assist clinicians with picking a particular antipsychotic over another. So there may be some either previous exposure or experience with the antipsychotics, or there may be certain symptoms that we know might be treated better with a particular medication than with another. In these types of scenarios, having a stepped approach to care, as insurers often do, or restricting the use of certain medications may not always be efficient, in that covered drugs may be known to be ineffective, but then with the stepped approach, you may have to try one of these drugs first before moving to another. And there may be known effective alternatives that may not be covered or affordable, which means patients either can't get them or there is additional difficulties in being able to get those medications. Patients have preferences for particular health outcomes, so the value of each therapy may be different for each individual patient. We need to obtain patient preferences for therapy and potentially tailor therapies to the individual. Using the mean effects in these types of settings for estimating cost effectiveness may fail to maximize the benefits. So patients who receive little benefit may discontinue therapy and not stay engaged with the healthcare system or with their physician, may not receive an effective therapy, and then we're not maximizing health in those scenarios. And this type of information is usually not well studied in clinical trials. We don't really know much about how or why patients discontinue their medications. Another thing is the need for individualized therapies. So patients with multiple chronic conditions may benefit to a greater degree from particular therapies. An example for this might be ACE inhibitors in patients with diabetes, where the therapies may provide a much greater benefit than might be estimated in a cost effectiveness analysis looking at ACE inhibitors for diabetes, unless you build in these other components and comorbidities into any type of an estimate. You won't know the effects, or you won't be able to estimate the ancillary effects of these therapies. And then there's this concept of externalities, that certain therapies may extend beyond the benefits, and sometimes the cost may extend beyond the treatment of an individual patient. Two good examples of this are the concept of herd immunity for some types of vaccines. Once you achieve a certain vaccination rate in the population, depending on how infectious the condition is that's being vaccinated against, what ends up happening is with a smaller pool of potentially infectable people, the risk of being infected drops dramatically. Another good example is treatment of HCV, where if we decrease the pool of people who have hepatitis C, the likelihood of others being infected also drops dramatically. And so these are good examples of externalities where treating everyone or more people may provide greater benefits than treating fewer people does. And then just knowing that one has access to treatment and care provides benefit to patients. So having broader health insurance, knowing that you're going to be covered in any event, not knowing what illness you may develop in the future, provides comfort to people and benefit. There's other moral considerations that we need as well. And one of them is, how much is society willing to pay for an additional quality? That is something that's not explicit anywhere. It's maybe in NICE where they have a threshold that they consider, but there are other considerations as well that might impact the threshold or the decision to cover something. And then, as we're going to see, including additional cost offsets and benefits, taking broader perspectives, tends to make quality, the cost per quality, look better. So you either lower the cost or increase the benefit in that equation, and you end up getting a different cost effectiveness ratio, and it looks better and better the more things you include that are benefits of the therapies. And then that sort of begs the question, does that change the threshold that we use then? And it likely should. And then, should the maximum price per additional quality be the same for everyone? Or should individuals who can afford more care be able to purchase more care, be able to purchase more coverage? And that's something that's not really clear also, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of research on that in the literature. So now let's get into the frameworks. The first one I want to cover is the American Society of Clinical Oncology. And they're the only ones that really talked about core principles from which they're going to focus in developing their framework. And those core principles were that the physician-patient relationship is of central importance. Patients need access to clinical and cost information, and physicians have a responsibility to both the patient and to society. I'm not sure I agree completely with all of these core principles, but it helps with understanding how and why they developed the framework the way they did. They developed two versions. One is for incurable disease and one is for curable disease. The first thing they wanted to look at was the first domain is clinical benefit. So each therapy is graded on a score of 1 to 5 based on improvement in median overall survival, or where that's not available, progression-free survival and response rate for advanced disease, and they use hazard ratios for overall survival for curable disease. And I hope this isn't too blurry, but this is just gives you an idea of what the worksheet looks like that is expected to be filled out for each therapy that's being considered. All right, the next domain that they look at is toxicity, and they look at the relative toxicity of a new agent against comparators, and each new therapy or relative to another comparator is given a categorical value of -20 to +20, and it's based on the frequency of grade 3 to 5 toxicities from clinical trials. And then you can get bonus points for therapies that have some palliation bonus, like say therapy for lung cancer that shrinks the tumor and improves the symptoms of lung cancer. That type of a therapy would receive some additional bonus points. And treatment-free interval also gains bonus points, so not needing another therapy gets additional bonus points. And then here's the rest of the worksheet that it's expected to work through to develop this. It's a really busy worksheet. That's why I wanted to put it up there. It's kind of hard to follow. And then after all of this, what they do is they calculate the net health benefit. It's calculated from the clinical benefit and toxicity scores. It includes bonus points for the advanced disease framework. And the maximum score for advanced disease, because of the bonus points, is 130. For the curative framework, it's 100. And then they look at the cost, drug acquisition cost and patient cost. And you'll notice that these costs don't consider insurers' costs or other costs. It's just drug acquisition and patient cost. And then there's a summary assessment, which is handled with these last pieces of the framework. The next one I want to cover is the ACC-AHA statement on cost per value methodology. And with this one, this is done entirely through systematic review of the literature. So, and it follows the ACC-AHA framework for looking just at clinical benefits and from their previous statements and methodologies. So they do a systematic review of the literature. They generate statements on value. They generate grading level for the quality of evidence, and then they assess the level of value and grade that level of value that's provided. This is the table that's generated from it. You can have a level A, level B, or level C on the left-hand side recommendation, and then the class of benefit. Does the benefit greatly exceed the risks, moderately exceed the risks, or is the risk higher than the benefit for a particular therapy? And so depending on where a therapy falls after the review, it falls into one of these boxes and it gets a class 1, 2A, or 2B, or class 3 recommendation, along with the level of evidence. And then as far as the value piece, this is the piece that they've added. It's determined to be of high value if the evidence shows that there's better outcomes at a lower cost or the ICER is less than 50,000 per quality gained. So here they are using the incremental cost effectiveness ratios as their assessment for value. Intermediate value is 50 to 150,000 per quality gained. Low value is greater or equal to 150,000 per quality gained. And then uncertain value is where there's insufficient data to make a recommendation. And then not assessed value is not assessed by the committee. They also recommend the quality of any the quality of any papers that are reviewed, manuscripts that are reviewed, are assessed using the QHES, which is quality of health economic studies instrument. And it's one that's been validated and is gaining wider and wider acceptance in the literature as being one of the primary methods of assessing the quality of health economics studies.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
This is fascinating stuff to juxtapose all these different value-based frameworks. Feel free to criticize or critique any of them as you go. I was just wondering what that point system was based on. Is it actually any kind of, is it completely arbitrary, or did they get through some kind of hierarchical process or DCE to get these weights?
I believe it was an expert panel that they used to generate these. It's somewhat arbitrary, yeah,
Okay.
based on experts and people who are familiar with health economics literature. This is out of the University of Washington, their group that developed this. And it's been around now for 12 years or so. Yeah, that piece is, yeah. So the next one is the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, and their way of visualizing value was to separate everything into blocks and just make a very visual representation of 5 key domains, 5 key measures. The first one is efficacy, the second is safety, third is quality of evidence, consistency of evidence, and affordability. And from this, they get this nice little box. All of these are graded on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being the lowest level of evidence, 5 being the highest level of evidence, or the most benefit on these 5 different domains. And you get a quick visual view. They don't do anything to combine the estimates, though. So I'm going to flip through these fairly quickly, but just to give you an idea of how the point system works for efficacy. 5 is often provides long-term survival or has curative potential. Again, this is for cancer. 3 is modest, and 1 provides symptomatic benefit only. This is for efficacy. For safety, 5 is uncommon or minimal side effects. 1 is usually severe, significant toxicities or life-threatening fatal toxicities. For quality, 5 is multiple well-designed randomized trials and or meta-analyses. 3 is low-quality randomized trials. 2 case reports, and 1 is little or no evidence. And then for consistency, the degree to which clinical trials addressing an intervention have consistent results. 5 is multiple trials with similar outcomes. 2, for example, is meaningful differences in direction of outcome between quality trials. 1 is evidence in humans based upon anecdotal experience. For affordability, it goes from very expensive being 1 and very inexpensive being 5. So 5 being better because the medication is less expensive. So that's the NCCN methodology. The other thing is they grade the evidence as category 1, 2A, 2B, or 3 using a very similar method to the AHA-ACC framework.
So what do you think of that? Very expensive. That's really specific, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
What kind of traction is this getting, Dan?
I think the cancer ones are getting a fair amount of traction, specifically in cancer.
NCCN?
Yeah. Yeah, that this is, and the NCCN now has an extensive database of all therapies that they have applied this framework to. So clinicians can go to that database and see for some new cancer therapy how it compares with other therapies using this valuation framework.
How about from the payer perspective? Did they use it to assess value?
That I don't know.
So it's a tool intended for clinicians primarily as opposed to the payer?
That seems to be. I don't know for certain. I just know that our cancer clinicians here are very familiar with this methodology and have looked at these reports, many of them. So I think that it's gaining some traction.
Clinicians like it, but the payers don't even find it useful at all.
I don't know if the payers find it useful or not. Yeah.
No, I do. I've been at
okay.
meetings.
You're saying they don't.
Payers don't use it at all.
Yeah, well, it
The
doesn't.
ICER framework that you're going to get to, that's what they like.
So I'll get to it quickly here. There's another cancer institute that's come out with their own. And this one looks at dollars per year, toxicity discount for drugs with severe side effects as a multiplier. What they do is they put in all of these different factors as multipliers. And then they have what's kind of, it's been criticized as being an opaque or non-transparent method for using these multipliers to come up with some estimate of benefit or cost benefit from these. It's called the drug abacus. You can go in and you can put in your own inputs into this, which is, I guess, is kind of an interesting approach to it, and come up with comparisons for a company's price versus one based on value and whether that is appropriate. So they have for, I guess, 50 cancer drugs, what their conclusions were about value, or what would be a reasonable price to pay for the therapy. And then there's a new one that's just come out, 2017, which is the patient perspective value framework. With this one, it really does focus. It's a patient-centric approach. Patient preferences include values, needs, goals and expectations, and financial trade-offs. And then the outcomes that they're interested in are quality of life, sorry for the typo, complexity of regimen, efficacy and effectiveness, and safety, so side effects and complications. They incorporate patient and family costs, quality and applicability of evidence, and usability and transparency as the main domains that they evaluate. And then they have this really cool graphic which kind of shows how each of these domains interact with the other domains. Patient preferences kind of are surrounding everything in this. Quality and applicability of evidence is one piece. The outcomes are one piece. The costs are one piece. And then usability and transparency is kind of outside of all of this, but I guess a consideration for patients and possibly for payers. Some of the limitations that I've seen so far with this is just lack of data. They're currently in a validation process for this framework. There's no usable reports available yet using this framework to value any of the drugs, but they're doing some validation studies. And population weights, patient out-of-pocket and family costs, epidemiology for many conditions is not well enough elucidated. Treatment effects, patient preferences for those treatments are often not available in the literature. So it's not clear to me at this point. Maybe we'll see after the validation, they'll tweak it a little bit to include some of, or to find ways to include some of this data. But I don't know where they're going to get the data from. Having done a number of these types of analyses, we don't even have data sometimes on the clinical effects of drugs as they're coming out. Never mind what patients think of those, or other pieces like that. It also doesn't consider societal or healthcare costs. It's truly patient-centric in everything they do. And the weighting may be condition and patient-specific, which to me brings up this concern about validation of these methodologies. Do they produce consistent results and comparable results? And we're going to have to wait for their validation studies before we see how they address some of these issues.
What's the group that's doing that?
Faster Cures is the name of the organization, yeah.
It's Avalier and Faster Cures within the Milken Institute.
Oh, Milliken?
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't see that on what I was reviewing, but makes sense. So for calculated, here's their timeline. The plan is last and this year to build it. They're starting to get into refining and testing it right now, and then the plan is to implement it. And like I said, they haven't implemented it yet, so there's no examples of how this framework would apply to costs. All right, finally, ICER. We're kidding. So ICER, they have a conceptual structure for their value assessment framework. They're interested in two main things when they're talking about value: long-term value for money based on comparative clinical effectiveness, other benefits, estimated incremental cost effectiveness, and contextual considerations. So cost effectiveness, again, is what they focus on primarily and what we're doing with them. And then short-term affordability through potential budget impact. In the long-term value for money, they do take a long-term, they take a lifetime perspective in evaluating all therapies. Evaluation of the evidence is based on comparative clinical effectiveness where that's available, but they do accept multiple forms of evidence. So where there aren't clinical trials describing some of the benefits, toxicities, epidemiology, whatever needs to be part of the model, they do accept other type of evidence, as is common when developing these types of models, but they explicitly state that. There's recognition that what matters most to patient is not limited to just the clinical outcomes, and acknowledgement of the role of contextual considerations, things like engagement of patients and clinical expert stakeholders to try and get some of those contextual scenarios where something might be different than what you would expect in the general population. For short-term affordability, they take a 5-year time horizon and calculate they create a budget impact model in a consistent way that values or that estimates the cost of different budgets at a U.S. System level. All right, here is one of the ways that ICER tries to get at other benefits and disadvantages. So they ask a question of their panel. So they assemble these panels of clinicians and patients and insurance providers and other businessmen who may have an interest in healthcare. And they ask them these different questions. So when compared with the comparator used in the cost effectiveness analysis, does this intervention offer one or more of the following benefits? And then there's a list of benefits that they have here. Another way that they engage for contextual considerations is, are any of the following contextual considerations important in assessing this intervention's long-term value for money? You know, things like this intervention is intended for the care of individuals with a chronic condition that represents a particularly high lifetime burden of illness. You know, is that a consideration? So while it's not incorporated into their cost effectiveness analyses, they do address some of these questions sort of outside of the scope of the cost effectiveness analysis. And then there's continuous efforts to improve transparency. There's processes for the systematic review. They have all of those published. They have they're working on ways to improve model transparency so that others can view pieces or the model in its entirety. We're working through some of the issues right now on how that might occur. And then they have well-described analysis plans and timelines for review. So those are the main frameworks that are out there right now. I just have a couple of comments. Should only take a couple of minutes, and then probably have time for 1 or 2 questions. So key considerations for improving these frameworks. One is the assessment of value should be separate from assessments of budget impact and affordability. All of this comes from this Dubois paper, value assessment of frameworks. How do they meet the challenge? So that's one critique. Another critique is value assessments should incorporate what is important to patients, even if the end user is the payer. Value assessments should adopt broad system perspectives in what they assess and how they do it. And that value is dynamic and needs to be considered and captured over time. So as a therapy matures, the cost effectiveness analysis should be redone and then redone again and redone again as costs and other care changes. Value assessments should be transparent and reproducible. There's a diversity of approaches, and they should perhaps all be considered. And then insurance reform is also needed along with improvements in value assessment frameworks. So those are the main critiques. Pharma has also released a list of critiques about these different value frameworks. Some of the key things is that they should undergo thorough validation and testing that gets at some of the transparency issues. Where's the other one? Use rigorous methods, make them transparent to researchers and users. incorporate a broad range of high-quality evidence, considers the broad effects of health interventions. These are important to consider because the more that's included in these, the more cost offsets, the more other beneficial things, the better and better the incremental cost effectiveness ratio looks. And so if we maintain a particular threshold, more therapies start to look cost effective as you incorporate or as you include more of the benefits and more of the societal benefits. So just for a quick discussion, there's many frameworks available. Some are specialized, some are more general. Insurer or population focus versus patient focus. The value domains sometimes are presented separately, sometimes they're combined. And some are just a review of the literature, and some actually create their own value estimates like ICER. Some adequately represent the patient's perspective, but that's complicated to do because data is often is unavailable, and then externalities are not usually known. Preferences for treatment effects are not well known. So there's a lot of unknowns when you start bringing in the patient perspective because our research and the pharmaceutical company's research typically doesn't focus on this patient perspective until after the drug is out. But these decisions have to be made well before. And even for some therapies, going far out into the future, this type of data never becomes available. Transparency is an issue that may never be fully addressed. Models are often viewed as intellectual property, so making them available is not necessarily all that great. And then certain processes, how each member voted, for example, when you have these panels who vote on whether something should or should not be considered cost effective, those processes sometimes need to be kept. Each individual's voting may need to be kept more secret because it leaves the evaluators' reputations open to potentially unfair and irrelevant criticism. One of the things that we're going through right now with ICER, with making our models available, it's always possible that there's going to be errors or bugs in the models. And what we're finding is that, or what we suspect might happen, is pharmaceutical companies, when they have the opportunity to evaluate a model, they won't necessarily tell you that there's a bug in the model until it comes to the public venue when you're presenting your model results, and then they come out and say, but the model's flawed, and here's why it's flawed. And so then it throws the entire estimate that you have, that you presented in jeopardy. So there's politics that go on with all of this. And so that's an important consideration as well. And then there's criticisms of frameworks' inability to capture all the potential benefits, and I've covered this pretty extensively. But in the example that we did, which was tardive dyskinesia, most of the research on tardive dyskinesia stopped around 1995 when the new atypical antipsychotics became available. When that happened, we thought that we had cured this idea of tardive dyskinesia, but these atypicals actually have about a third of the rate of tardive dyskinesia, and it's still substantial. It's about 13 to 15% of people who take these drugs long term, the atypicals long term, get tardive dyskinesia, and 30% of those taking traditional antipsychotics, the typical ones, are likely to develop tardive dyskinesia. So, but there's no information about the impact of tardive dyskinesia, or as little information on utilities, on probabilities of how it affects people's work, how it affects their, how the stigma of having TD might affect their lives and impact their lives. So it's hard to incorporate these things into a model when there's no information on them. And with that, I'm going to take maybe a couple of questions if we have time.
I have a couple of questions as it relates to ICER and the discussion points that you talked about. Do they make their voting completely transparent now in their panels that they hold regionally across the country?
So
I know
if you're,
that they have dissenting opinions that they publish you know, if it's a 5-3 vote or a 5-2 vote,
Yeah.
they'll ask for a dissenting opinion comment.
Right. They do not give the names of the individuals and how they voted. What they do is they summarize them. They may say 12 of the members of the panel voted in one way, one member voted in the opposite way. Or, you know, if they're using a grade scale, they'll
So they haven't gone to the level of transparency that you talked about as a
right.
possibility.
But that's what's being requested by pharma, which could potentially be problematic. If you're at the meeting, you know who votes one way or another because it's all just done by show. Actually, that may not be true with ICER.
Online.
Yeah, they have the clicker, so you don't necessarily know. They do, what made me think that it was open was they ask a question after the voting that is, you know, the individual who voted one way, you don't have to give your reason, but is there a particular, you know, does someone have a particular reason? Or individuals who voted a particular way, do you have reasons for voting that way? And it's up to the individual who voted that way to volunteer additional information or not.
And they kind of just play devil's advocate on the transparency of models.
Yeah.
I get sort of not wanting to have a bug identified late in the process and lose credibility, but isn't finding that bug better than not finding that bug? I mean, you say your estimates are accurate.
Right, and that's some of the things that we're discussing in these groups, in our methods calls, is should we have validation by another university? Like, does it have to be someone with a vested interest in the outcome of that model doing the validation process, or could it be someone else with that type of specialized knowledge doing the validation, finding the bugs, reporting it, and fixing the bugs before we actually go to the meeting to present the results of those models? And then there's still that issue of you know, ownership of the model and allowing other people to see it. Some people on the calls have problems with that, others don't. But no, you're absolutely right. I think fixing the bugs is real important. Often they don't have a big effect, or you would have found them. So they don't have a huge effect. But the concern is that if it's left up to those who have vested interest, one way or the other, that the issues will come out in the public forum, not before, where they can be corrected. Anyone else have questions? Yeah.
Does ICER actually have a threshold ICER?
ICER evaluates therapies at 50, 100,000, and 150,000 per quality gained, but the focus is on the 100 and 150. Yeah, and we're also now starting to use the second panel on cost effectiveness, that inventory, to document what is included in each of the different perspectives to try and improve the transparency. Yes.
When you mentioned all these frameworks, they really like they use like some kind of MCDA framework to make the decision analysis. Is that what they are doing explicitly? They have different weights for the different criteria. That is somewhat what they are doing, but not.
Yes. So some of them are using weights. For example, the patient PPV1, whatever it's called, is using patient weights. So as the patients put in what they view as being most important, it weights all of the outcomes according to those. For some of the others, you know, the ASCO, the clinical oncology one, they have an explicit weighting system that's very clearly stated and pretty simple. But it's not always clear how those weights were determined, you know, how they were going to be used.
I guess we probably have to get out.
Okay. All right.